Good morning, Yuri.
Good morning. Good morning, Glenda. Good morning, Ava.
Okay.
So, Ava, did by any chance this meeting get canceled and rescheduled?
This one, no.
Okay.
Does it not show up on your calendar as a series or?
I didn't think it was there. It could be me. Okay, that's the reason why I was asking.
Because yesterday I did cancel a meeting in the series, but that was for November. So you
Okay.
might have gotten that notification.
And
For
maybe that's why I thought it was canceled. And then when I looked to all of a sudden I looked a little while ago and I was like, oh, I got a meeting. So that's why I was asking. So it must have been later.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you guys doing today?
All right. Today's the final day for submissions, so I've been kind of spamming social media for. I thought of doing a post saying, "Attention, all procrastinators." Today's.
that would catch people's attention. I think that'd be really good, actually.
I don't see anything wrong with
Would I offend the procrastinators to the point they wouldn't submit?
that. Well, I guess you could soften it up by saying, if you like to do things at the last minute, now's your last chance.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I ended up not using the term, but I was so tempted. Uh, you're looking for an adrenaline rush? You got 6 hours. Uh, you might an even higher adrenaline rush. Start after dinner.
Oh, geez, there you go.
Uh, Oh, well, all right. So, anyways, enough about that. But we do have actually some really good submissions. I'm just trying to get more diversity in stakeholders, like people who maybe we haven't had in a conference, and just really trying to find lots of innovative new approaches to that. But and we've got a good program. We've got some two great keynotes, um, an academic from Mass General and Harvard Medical School, and then a CEO of a mental health company. So she's also an instructor at Harvard. And then our innovation track has some really good people, two CEOs, a venture capital person, and a former Pfizer executive. So people will be able to get good feedback on their startup ideas. So great. And there are two people who have come to our conference. One just launched a new startup inspired by what happened at actually I have two people have started startups. And so it's great. And then a third one is about to get a large ARPA-H grant on ideas that were percolated on that. So yeah, and all of these people are wanting to come back to DCA Network and continue meeting people for collaboration. So the goal was to be a catalyst for innovation. I think we're getting there, and I think I want to make sure we maintain our patient centricity. So thank you, Glenda, and others for keeping us grounded on what matters. And I'll follow up with you and Ava on the panel and workshop. But let me pass it over to Ava. I've asked her to run the meeting with the agenda. So over to you, Ava.
So what I wanted to go over for today is if you were at one of the previous working group meetings this week, we were talking about how we want to evaluate and measure accuracy for the responses of the chatbot. And I noticed that was one of the action items on the working group 2.3 project tracking was sort of determine how we would be doing that. If the group had any ideas on methods and being able to report that, because if we figure that out now, that would be something that we could talk about at the conference. And then the second thing was the agenda item that I sent out to you guys this morning. Basically planning and brainstorming what we would be able to discuss and present at the June conference. Because I know, I think at a previous 2.4 meeting, Yuri listed some potential presentations and papers. So one possibility would be co-design. So the stuff that Glenda, Betsy, Gianna, and I have been doing with like co-design and allyship, that can either be like a paper that comes out of the like what we're doing with the conference, could be like another quick presentation, something like that. And then for evaluation, being able to do like a presentation instead of a paper, basically on like the new ways of evaluating some of the metrics that we're using in the chatbot. So working on the accuracy stuff, empathy, the health literacy stuff, some of the new things that Catherine showed us earlier this week. So showing how users are able to choose which like health literacy levels and empathy levels they want to see in the chatbot, and then how do we even measure that and say, okay, these are like reliable measures for empathy and health literacy, and we can say that there are differences in the chatbot responses. Then the third paper, I think, was on scalability and integration. I think Yuri was gonna take the lead on that one. It has people like Lance, David, Kieran, and some people from the oncology group. So if just as a refresher, we contacted some doctors from the oncology group at BI and presented our chatbot, so then we could work with them for recruitment, so they could also be involved in the paper and maybe a presentation at the conference. And then the last thing was KPI for digital engagement. So basically, how would we measure patient engagement and being able to evaluate that sort of stuff in real world settings? So I think it would be a good idea to go over specifically what sort of things we want to talk about at the conference, like maybe as a presentation or a panel, and then what things we could have come out of the conference as a paper. So
Ava, I just want to go back for a second to the allyship program, and you were talking about the co-design there. So the allyship paper document that we've been working on, I viewed it being more specific to DCI. But so if we're talking about co-design and wanting to look, I would say, from a conference standpoint, I wouldn't make that so much DCI, but in a broader perspective.
exactly, yeah, something like this is what we're working on. This is how other hospitals or other places can do it, you know, in their
Right. So,
like that.
so it's taking those key components and bringing them forth, but not the details to DCI.
Exactly. And then
Okay.
like you guys being able to describe like this is what we would want to see. And this is what patients and patient advocates, this is what they want to see in these sorts of programs. And this is what the expectations would be, something like that. I think that would be really interesting to have like as a discussion.
So you're looking for that to be like Betsy and myself or whoever presenting? Are you looking for it to be a panel discussion? So, I mean, I think that would be good. I'm just trying to understand the framework and how we want to position it. Or is that something we go back to day 3 and also build it out more? So
Mhm.
that's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to understand here.
Like I thought two options would be having a panel where you and Betsy and then even Gana can join and like basically to talk about the different aspects of the allyship program and building it up and sort of like where you want to see it. Or another thing, which was what you mentioned was really good, is going into the workshop and have it be like one of the things that we discuss, like, okay, how would we integrate this into like the real world scenarios that we talk about in the workshop? Is that sort of what you were thinking of?
Yeah, because because I still think that I want to say more of the startup companies, and I've said this before, they'll say that we're patient centric, but they don't really have patients involved in that design discussion and view them as stakeholders. They'll view them as participants to get comments and feedback, but not as stakeholders. So I think that we can talk about that within the conference and then build that out because it comes back to that white paper I think we've talked about on day 3 and having people involved with what do we really need to do to value patients being the stakeholders.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense because then, yeah, even at the workshop, you can tell them like, you guys talk about this is a good idea. We have to do this, but like, okay, in your own companies, how do you actually execute the stuff? Where do you need to look? What materials, resources you have to have, and all of that. So that would actually be really good.
So I'm going to ask David. For you, I mean, I know with a lot of the pharmaceutical companies that I work with today, they are beginning to look at patients as stakeholders. I think in some of the smaller startup companies, I don't see that happening. So for you, David, do you see it at Takeda?
I know. So where the group I sit in, Glenda, I'm not really the authoritative person to answer that question. Because in regulatory labeling, we don't often interface with patients. That's more in part of the commercial medical information side of our company. We do try to bring patients into everything we do, though. I mean, we've had patients come to present to our team on group meetings and talk about the impact of the drugs. I know that there's we try to get patient reported outcomes into our data sets so we can really share how our drugs are impacting people in a certain way. And I know it's big part of the development we do. But it's really, I can't give you I couldn't get into any higher level or more details than that higher level overview. So it's something where we engage with patients to speak at events and we bring them in. So like I'm sure you probably have done something like that for maybe for some other pharma companies where you talk about the impact of the medication on your life. You don't really can't really, well, you don't really talk about the impact of your medication on your life. You usually talk about your disease and how it's
Right,
impacted your life
right.
and then how you're doing today, but you don't actually directly state it's because of the medicine, right? There's certain rules that I think along around that, but we do that a lot. We do, and I know there's other things we do. Like I've seen patients at launch events to talk about the conditions and things like that. So they're
Right,
very much integrated everything we do. It's
right,
just,
right.
um,
I
I,
agree. So I
yeah.
agree with what you're saying, David. That's actually, but you know what? As you were talking, and where you said where you are.
Hmm.
So if you look at what we're doing, and we're
Yep.
talking about the prescription labels, all right. Do have you brought patients in to give you feedback around the prescription labels?
We haven't because, and this is something we got into and why I was really excited to do the consultation with you guys on the patient medication information. What was that? When we first all met like 3, 4 years ago now,
Yeah.
because It's a very heavy regulated document, and that document we mostly have to author to meet the FDA standards. And so the best influence we have on getting patient insights pulled into those documents is what we did together as part of DCI, which was let's review the PMI guidance, let's tear it apart and really try to advocate it from a patient's perspective, and really pull those insights into there. We definitely do user testing with patients for like when we have IFUs to see where there might be things that are confusing in the labels. And I would say, yeah, that's really the only time we get an opportunity to do what you would want to do because of the regulatory landscape. So it's really we're more handcuffed by the FDA in a lot of ways than anything else.
So if we look at it from a patient standpoint, and I understand what you're saying, David. Um, so getting back, we don't feel that patients are really adhering to necessarily their medicines um, as prescribed for various reasons. And that's the reason why we're looking at the chatbot. But as you said, you're meeting the regulatory requirements, but maybe there are changes that need to happen. And especially as, the digital world evolves even more. And so how do we collect the data to be able to make those changes? And I think that's where the patient comes as the
Yeah.
key participant. So I'm talking out loud, and I'm sorry I'm taking the time, but I think we need to have a session maybe just to focus on it. But this is where I see, the challenge and how we can then keep it to what our mission is, but also get the input from others around how do we make the change here.
I mean, just to follow up on that, Glenda, I mean, I think one of the things I like about being part of DCI is I look at it as an opportunity to interface with patients like yourself, on what would be useful, and then how do we turn those usefulness statements into advocacy positions to change regulators' minds. So so that's where I think the papers that we can create then become publications that then we can then present in front of them. We can possibly talk to them about do more integration, look for opportunities for face-to-face meetings with people at FDA, and then that's how we try to move the needle there. So there's like an advocacy piece of things that we could potentially be getting into that does pull the patient perspective into what we're doing because patients have been front and center of everything we've been doing with DCI, from a development standpoint. So I think one thing you've said a lot this year, and I just agree with and want to echo as we're talking about this is getting other patient perspectives pulled into some of these things would be helpful in helping that narrative. You're amazing, but I mean more than just your voice, right?
Right. No, I understand. I agree. So you know what? I think what I just heard, David and I go back and forth, is very much, I think he and whoever else from DCI, I'm going to say our group, needs to talk about that, how they have seen the benefit as well. I think I thought Yuri wanted to say something there.
No.
So I think it's the collaboration of both sides presenting together to make that impactful to the audience.
And just like one of the things that I'd be interested in seeing is like I know a lot of people have raised like the exact same point that Dave just said, like, oh, there's a lot of like regulatory roadblocks and things like that. Also being able to mention what are the more like localized company specific or like group specific roadblocks, like what are some of the like just the logistical stuff. So it's like mentioning like the regulatory stuff makes the problem seem like super big and like nobody wants to approach it. So it's like if you like look at okay, what are like the smaller things that we can look at, like not just like company wide, maybe like a specific group or like a development team, things like that, and look at okay, this is what we've been doing in our working groups, like just starting with working groups and then DCI and then the hospital wide. So having like different tiers of, okay, this is how we made the changes, I think would make it seem less daunting for like companies to approach the sort of patient involvement.
I mean, it also means different things for different industries too. So, I mean, I don't think, I mean, I can only talk about really my experience with DCI and high level things at Takeda. We could definitely try to see if there's groups inside Takeda that could potentially help talk to a more engaged, like industry or Takeda basis on how the patients are pulled into certain projects. The but that's going to change from thing to thing. So I think when we talk about tech companies, it's going to be different than it is with pharma companies to a degree. So um, it depends on the goal of the presentation. If it's to talk about benefits of DCI and what we're trying to do and why patients are pulled into the co-development of the Empathica app, then I think that's something I can talk to. Valdichi, you've been part of this for a while. You can help talk to Glenda. We can talk to. If it's the other thing, like how do companies generically go like include patients in development, then that's a little bit different. So I think it just depends on what we're looking for.
And I think that's something that maybe could come out in the day 3 part of it. For example, there's a chart that they use to measure MG, the impact of MG on patients. And a lot of us as patients have complained about it, and it was developed in 1997. So because that's the FDA requirements for clinical trials, trying to get that change is a whole undertaking, and I'm told it could take 3 to 5 years by the time you collect the data. But I think, having the patient voice, and once you focus on what is the issue, then you can start to identify the steps that can be taken. So for us, I would probably keep it to Empathica and to what we consider success. But then what has been the learnings from both, I'm going to say like Dave from the technical side, and then Betsy and I from the patient side. And whoever else wants to talk about it. Val, I don't know if you have something you want to say here. I'm going to pull you in.
Oh, you talk to me?
Yeah, you. Yes.
Well, first I want to apologize. I have been so busy these days that I disappeared. I want to apologize, but I'm so happy to see all of you. And I know I'm late. So the discussion today is about the June conference and what is going to be discussed.
Yeah, and we were talking about how patients being involved in the DCI initiative, like the chatbot, and how we feel that has, well, I'm going to say, I think collectively we feel that's been a good thing. So with having the patient at the table, I can talk about what I feel has been the benefit from the patient side. But then and Dave was talking about it from his side, and I was just asking from your side, what do you feel has been, do you feel there's been a value working with the patients like myself and Betsy on the initiatives? And if so, what do you see as some of those benefits or change, or how it may have changed your mind thinking going forward with collaborating with patients?
Yeah. Absolutely right, because industries right all over are realizing that the patient's voice it's so important, right? They are incorporating in the clinical trial design, right? As you said, some questionnaires are so difficult, and I guess the industry suddenly realized that the patient is really the reason for everything. Because one thing, right? I mean, a lot of time I see these electronic things, but I don't have the appetite to to use because it's not in the format that I like to see, right? So, and we can design the most beautiful thing, but if it's not what the patient needs or is going to be easy to use, then right? Because can you imagine like a person under treatment for cancer, right? Unfortunately, I had the experience of in my family of somebody treated right. The chemotherapy, it's so right. It has so many side effects. So the patient doesn't have much energy. So then now you're going to ask the person to do a right. We need to make easy for the patient, and then yeah, I think the patient is going to be as important as the regulatory, right? Because yeah, I think that's the beauty of what Yuri's work is, right? That the patient has a central part.
Yeah. Yes.
And so um, and I have a question, right? Because maybe I'm not sure if it's the topic. Yuri, do you have like a contact at the FDA that could attend the meetings? Um,
Yes. Great question. First of all, I wanted to, sometimes I feel I speak too much at these meetings and I wanted to make sure everyone's voices, I wanted to hear all your opinions. So thank you, all of you, for your perspectives. So to answer your question, yes, somebody from the FDA, who they published, I posted a LinkedIn article. The FDA had did a position statement on patient centricity. And so I reached out to the FDA and found who is the manager of that group. And I'm not sure if they've scheduled the meeting or not, but she's replied to my email. She's interested in talking. I've asked her to come to the event and give the FDA's perspective of how they feel patient centricity should be, how they go about hearing the patient voice. And it was a position statement trying to get people who submit to the FDA more documentation about how they've engaged with patients. So hopefully she'll want to come. There's a whole process that I have to fill out a form.
yeah.
But they first have to agree on principle that they want to come, and then they fill out the form. So it's in process of me meeting them. And I'll put the link in a moment
Yeah.
to that, or maybe if Ava, you could find it. It's in the last month or so. So that's and I think to the broader discussion that's going on, I think patient involvement has often been done late, both in companies but also at hospitals. Um, Part of the reason why we have a patient and family advisory council at the hospital is to help give us more input sooner. Um, but still, it's not pervasive, and it's not sort of um, the standard operating procedure that when you start an initiative that you have patient involvement. And I think part of what we're trying to do with DCA Network, especially in the June conference, is make sure that the patient voice is more actively involved from the beginning, even in the conception of ideas.
Yeah.
And we've tried to practice that within what we've done. And because Glenda and Betsy joined at the very early stages as a DCA network. And each year when we talk about what we're going to work on this group the next year, all the voices are heard and the patients have an equal spot at the table. And so, I think with Ava, we've been trying to sort of, with the allyship program, is how do we support as we onboard new patients to the system to help them make sure that they feel comfortable and reflect on how we're actually doing the patient engagement within the network and continuously improve it. So it's both has two goals: education and preparation, but improvement of the process. And so I think the panel could reflect on what we've done, but it might be helpful to have a few other people from other organizations talk about how they've done it. I think having the FDA person on the panel. So one thing we could do is it could be a panel with somebody from DCA Network, maybe one of our patients, somebody from the FDA, and maybe from a pharma perspective. I think organizations sometimes get really tied up on the legalese of, getting patients to sort of see and comment on things that, uh, and for whatever reason, right, they may think. So I can sort of share with you what the concern was when we started DCA Network, was that one of the concerns was that drug companies and tech companies sell services to us, right? And we're not supposed to be seen as sort of an advertisement promo for any particular product. And so I went to great lengths to document what our goal was of DCA Network, and that, we're trying to build scalable ways of improving healthcare. We're not here to promote any one particular product. We're product agnostic. And, it's been wonderful. The life sciences companies, right, have been very collegial, and none of them have pushed any one particular label for us to work on. And so we've been able to get that structure. But I think, to David's earlier point, I think having patients more involved in the very design of the label, I think there's probably a varying level of experience by different life sciences company. So it might be interesting if the FDA in future requires documentation of patient involvement in not just labels, but other things, both for life sciences companies and hospitals. In the case of hospitals, it would be maybe the group that oversees our accreditation. And so there's a group called JACO, the Joint Commission on Healthcare Accreditation. And so I think these are some of the things that we could share. And for the minutes, by the way, this is the DCA Network 2.3 evaluation. I usually say it at the beginning so that when we transcribe it, a working group. But anyways, let me pass it over to all of you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to mention something to you that just occurred to me, and I think we haven't discussed that piece yet. Right, we want, right, as we develop the bot, right, we are setting that the bot will get the information about the medication to the FDA approved label, right, especially the label for the patient. But David is very aware of something, is that the FDA last year issue a draft resolution, I don't know how to say specifically, where they are considering change the patient leaflet to one single page. And at that time, David, I think you remember, right? I prepared some slides, I read the whole document. So there is a journey at the FDA that has lasted more than 20 years. And then they get patient input. They have many different ways of get input. And then it seems that they finally evolved into a thinking of bringing the patient leaflet to one single page. I don't know how pharma respond, but I personally thought that it would be truncated too much information. We can imagine, because right now, a med guide or a patient information has multiple pages. If you needed to put all that information in one single page, you might remove important information. And the reason I mentioned, right, that the FDA being engaged with us is that if they really evolve into transform the patient information into one single page, they need to be aware because, right, how the bot is going to get enough information from one single page to pass to the patient. So, Dave, do you wanna mention something because I know you.
Yeah, so we as the DCI, when that call for that one-page summary came out, we sent a thoughtful response to them.
Okay.
Unfortunately, 15,000 other people submitted responses, of which probably 10,000 were bots, um, who they should have put probably a bot checker on there. And we never heard anything back from them.
Nobody
So I
has
think
Yuri, so don't feel bad.
nobody, right? Nobody. And so, part of putting the FDA is sort of maybe putting them on the spot is, I mean, the person who came isn't the one who did it, but just to say that, there has to be a more transparent process for how we engage with patients, right? And the public, that if we ask for their opinion, what happens to that, right? Like which committee is working on it? The FDA and other government agencies are very um, kind of black box things. And, you know, maybe part of the reason they don't want people to put a requirement for patient input on labels and other things is probably because they don't want to be pressed for how they go about developing their policies, right? And so maybe the government, we should ask them that when they do these changes, they get patient input. When they did that proposal for that one page, they had hired a consulting company, and they said some really nasty, inaccurate things. They said there was no evidence that improving the or tailoring it to different languages, like literacy wasn't that big of a problem, or that you couldn't come up with the evidence on better graphics isn't available, right? Well, people have studied, iconography and how people understand, and there's a whole visual science about same with numeric literacy and how people understand which types of numbers people have more trouble understanding. And but they basically uh, dismissed that there was any body of science on patient communication. And there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of papers that have been published on that could be turned into more practice guidelines for how to communicate with patients. And it wasn't clear that they had ever talked to any patients at all. So, I think DCI could be a catalyst as we do these evaluations, right? What I'd like to show is that the standard of work that we've done on evaluations about has been very transparent. We've had patients at the table, private sector academics. We're publishing our methodology. And I think if the FDA is going to approve chatbots for therapeutics, there should be sort of standards for how AI has been evaluated. And I think we're at the cutting edge of that, being transparent. But I think there has to be some accountability of how you document, how you develop those standards, and how you maintain, like how did patients contribute to that? And I don't see many other organizations, both government and even private sector, being transparent about how they've done patient engagement. That's something I want to press at the conference when people say we engage in patients with patients. How did you engage them, right? And so that we share best practices, right?
Yeah,
And
I mean, there's a lot of legal barriers in how we have to do it from industry perspective, right? So that really governs a lot of the engagement we do and how we get to do it in places. Um, and Beldici, I think you maybe joined the call after I mentioned this, but this was prior to you joining DCI. We actually did partner with Yuri to submit comments on that guidance. So we submitted them
Okay.
not only as Takeda, but we also supported DCI and provided insights into the DCI comments that were submitted as well, that were more patient centric. Because I think, like you mentioned, um, an arbitrary length of whether it's one page, 2 pages, whatever, doesn't necessarily target improving patient understanding. It's more they're more condemning patients, saying that if it's longer than one page, patients won't bother to read it anyways. And that's not something that I think we would like to do in our where we come from, where we're focused on communicating the medical information in the best ways possible to the end users. That's what we care about as labeling professionals. We really do prefer those insights there, and so things that we're asked to do is reading level based, and then we have to meet certain regulatory standards for language, and then the FDA reviewer ultimately controls how things get approved. Um, Different markets have different practices. Like I know in Europe, they have readability testing, Yuri. That's part of their general practice, where patients are put into a room where you need to have a new leaflet read by patients or a patient advocacy group that then test it to see how well could they understand the information in the leaflet. Um, FDA hasn't gone in that direction for sure, numbers of reasons. Haven't looked into it myself, but there is some other market precedent for it. To your point, people in actually I was part of an industry paper with FPA that we talked about how to best communicate with patients, how do we pull them into the design of communication materials. So I could definitely share that paper with you. And people who helped write that paper might even be willing to present virtually if that's something you'd be interested in. It has people from Bayer and some other industry groups. I don't know if Pfizer was on that one, Beverly. I don't think I don't remember Pfizer being on that one, but um, we definitely worked with a bunch of folks on that, and we worked with patient groups on reviewing the paper. So they were very much into the review of the paper to pressure test some of the assertions that we were putting out there in that white paper. So there are some other things that we can think about. But I think moving the needle on advocacy on communication styles and what's best is something that, I'd love to see us go into. So I definitely appreciate the thought process.
So David, it seems that what you said, right, that how the information is provided to the patient, right, is driven by many things, including what needs to be right conveyed, but not right. It should not right. The number of pages, right, should not be the most important drive, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, I think maybe as we develop this panel and possibly a workshop, we could start identifying some best practices and also some barriers, both legal, regulatory, that there are for patient engagement. I should share with you that somebody from an academic who's involved with HL7 reached out to me and plans to submit a paper. And this person said, could we maybe have a panel with the HL7 patients that are involved in helping develop standards? And I said, that sounds like an interesting, potentially useful panel. But I said, I don't want to have patients coming and not being supported financially. I said, I can waive the registration fees, but I asked them, are these patients being compensated by HL7 for their service and when they go to travel? And so when we've had patients here on panels, we've covered their transportation costs, parking, in some cases hotels. We've given some honorarium. We're trying to actively, as we try to raise more funds, to be more proactive in covering that. And I said, well, can HL7 cover their travel? I'll waive their registration fee and you guys cover their travel, because I think one of them is in southern US and will need an airfare and so she was going to go speak to some senior people at HL7 whether they would do that. And I've yet to hear from them, but You know, we gave an honorarium at the last conference for our patients. I plan to continue to do that and cover their parking and hotel as needed. But those are for the ones we've been working with. And I think if other associations are going to want to be at our event and showcase what they're doing, they ought to sort of step up to the plate and have best practices. So part of this best practices is what are sort of the financial supports budgeting, right? And some of these associations, they say, "Oh, well, we don't have money." That's not true. I mean, these are some of these standards groups are really big, you know, and it's a matter of choice of how they spend their money on what it is. So I think that's sort of a one thing that you know has been evolving, and our our own lawyers have given us a hard time over compensating patients in terms of say, well, are they an employee, right? Are they acting in the way in which they're an employee? And it gets into these tax things and anyways, it's been sort of an unpleasant conversation with lawyers on this topic. Um, but anyways, I think that's something I want to sort of move forward as an open discussion is what should hospitals and companies and organizations, you know, when it comes to compensation, what are some fair and best practices and clarity on any laws? Because I'm really tired of these lawyers waiving all these. Well, that might not be allowed. And then I asked them, well, you know, which statute, which regulation do you have an issue? And anyways, I had a long exchange with a set of lawyers on this. And so as we've honorariums are okay. And so that's as far as I've gotten so far. But you know, I'd like to hopefully HL7 will be there and hopefully they will, but if there is going to be a panel with them, I've insisted they cover their patient travel. So we'll see. Beverly, I don't know if have you in the panels that you've been on HL7, have there been patients at some of the standards groups that you've been involved with HL7?
There has been, and there's different work groups. So a lot of times, you know, those different work groups, I mean, it's open to everybody, and there's different pricing, you know, based off of if you're a corporation, if you're for profit, if you're a nonprofit, et cetera. So you could have individual memberships or you could have group memberships.
Yeah.
But a lot of times too, what happens is you have patient advocacy groups that will join and are a member, and they bring patients as well. So there's all types of ways to approach it.
Yeah. So, you know, I'm part of IEEE and it's a volunteer group. So everyone who shows up for meetings is volunteering their time. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that's the same. I mean, HL7 is people want to volunteer. But like I said, depending, like when I represent Pfizer, we have a corporate membership. So they tier it based off of, you know, what groups pay, what they can pay. So for individuals, it's, you know, very minimal.
Yep. Okay. I wanted to show you one other thing that I've been working on. It's still in rough draft, but so I didn't have it circulated. But we have a bunch of personas that we've generated, additional ones, so about 30 more, and that have different socio-economic backgrounds and literacy levels. And what I'm thinking of is creating some questions for the chatbot to test whether it can contextualize the answers based on the clinical history of the patient and the level of literacy. And so we'll tell that this person's a low literacy, has these conditions, and so have some standardized questions for each patient. And then we'll use our scales to evaluate that. This is in addition to testing it with real person, but have a group of 30. And then we could benchmark all the LLMs based on the same 30 personas, the same questions, and the same scales. And so then I wanted to make sure we had a diversity of types of personas. So here is a rough draft of what this could look like. So this is, let me make this a little bit bigger. So this would be different, the columns are different aspects of evaluation, clinical accuracy, empathy. And we can, for each one of these, we'll have to come up with the actual scale and method that we do. We've been using some, but some of these we haven't done. So we've done empathy and literacy level. We will need to come up with a process for, who reviews the clinical accuracy, right? It'll have probably a subject matter expert. We've got some usability skills we've used before. I don't think we have a good metric or method for cultural sensitivity and personalization. We haven't really talked about a way for bias in the response. This would be with the actual users who use it, how long they use the chatbot, do they come back and use it overall? And then each of the, we'd have different types of users categorized by level of health literacy and tech literacy and other social demographics. So the 30 or more test cases would all be here. That way we could sort of, I'm trying to get a more representative distribution of what the American population is. And eventually, if we were going to do this at large scale, say with 10,000 people, we'd want also a different distribution. Since we've had trouble getting low literacy people to recruit it in person, I think one way we could mitigate that, and the next one is to have these virtual personas and do that. I still want to find a way of recruiting a broader diversity, but at least this will give us a sort of a way of testing the boundaries of how well the LLM can adapt to different users. This is just a draft, but wanted to just share that with you, get your opinions. You can share it now, or we can probably more likely discuss it at the next meeting. But so it'll take some time to sort of go through this table and again,
It would be interesting to see how we would measure the cultural sensitivity stuff. Like there has to be some scales or measures out there.
yeah.
Right?
I don't know if there is like there might be. I hope there is. I'm not sure if they've been validated. And Ava and I are working on another grant on culturally adaptive mental health apps, and I'm really curious to figure out how they've done the cultural adaptation. How do you evaluate it, right?
I was just gonna say we can talk to Farouk and see what their measures were, and because his is also like the ICBT, so
Yeah.
it's like a digital tool,
Yeah.
so it might translate. Yeah.
Yeah. So that I think is bias. People always talk about bias, but how do you measure it, right? And could we give like could a chatbot be discovered to sort of have stereotypes, bad stereotypes, make us, I'm starting to find social media because my last name's Quintana. I'm getting served Hispanic ads. And mean, I guess it's not that intuitive leap to just look at a name like Quinten and think maybe it's Hispanic.
You, you, I'm so sorry. Can you tell me what I'm seeing here in this table? I'm still,
So this is an evaluation grid. So we have 30 different personas that we've generated of a different range of health literacy and tech literacy. And the idea is to sort of, for each one of those, come up with a set of questions that they may likely ask. And then the question is, how do we see how well it adapts to that persona? So we may have, like, we have different things of expected level, like would it, for example, for certain people, would it adjust not only the literacy level, but maybe the empathy, or if the person's has a cultural background, does it add any cultural references, and are they helpful or not helpful, right?
okay. For example, in the first line, right? The first line, the first one says low SCS.
Yeah. And so in here, we would say which personas number so-and-so fall in this. So when we go to look at the results, we can say the performance of, we'd have a score for each of these criteria. And then we'd be say it works particularly well with low literacy, or maybe it does not work particularly well with low literacy, right? Or it's not, we could see how it performed either by type of user or by criteria, or both, right?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. For example, right, in let's say the first row, right, there is a description of a persona, right, which is an elderly rural, right, with limited English. And then the next, I'm so sorry, I'm a little bit lost on how to read this table, because the next says clinical accuracy, and then says high.
Yes. So for all of these users, it has to be very high accuracy, because none of these patients, we don't want to have particular problems with them. For somebody who has high literacy, then the ability to adjust to literacy level is not as important as someone that is low literacy, right?
Oh, these are the set criteria.
Yeah, these are the criteria at the top,
Okay.
and these are different types of users.
Okay,
And
so
then,
you might accept some, right?
So then we'll be able to group users by, one or more category, and say for these 10 users that fit this category, how did they do here? And some of these criteria will be more important to certain groups than others. So when we look at all the results, we'll be able to analyze them by community. And then, so I was trying to make sure that, one, we have users in each of these categories, and then that we have a scale for each one of these as well. So we'll have an overall score, but then we can subdivide it by group and see how well it did. And for some of these groups, certain criteria will be more relevant. That's sort of the idea.
So basically, you're behind, like, for example, clinical accuracy. We'll have some transparency as to, not only the scale, but then also how that was evaluated. Is that human in the loop or just AI with?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that way we can make sure that we have users in every category and a good scale for everyone. And then we'll be able to see which one is better at that. So, right. So like I said, it's in draft, but I will. All right. So I think we had a really good discussion today on sort of the patient involvement in not only our projects but how they could be more involved in across industries. And let's maybe through the minutes and between now and the next meeting, think about whether we want to have a panel on this and maybe a workshop day and how to go about best practices for co-design and patient engagement. And then who do you want to have in the room? Okay. And hopefully we'll hear back from HL7 that they want to support their patients, and I'll meet them halfway there, and hopefully they'll be there. I'm cautiously
Yuri?
optimistic that's going to work.
Yeah. So Yuri, do you have a minute
Sure.
afterwards?
Sure.
You and
All
Ava,
right.
maybe? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
All right.
you,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Take care,
Take care.
everybody. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.